Hi, Umar. Welcome back. Nice to see you. Okay.
Thank you.
You expressed a desire to discuss on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict currently. For the viewers, let me make it clear. Umar is a blogger. He's the co-host of The Red Pill. He's the co-founder of Vicharak. He's a writer, he's a drummer, he's a rapper, multi-talented Aligardian, right? And one of my inspirational people, what I say, my kind of Muslim, right? Who takes interest in history, philosophy, and geopolitics. So, Umar, I want you to start with the city of Jerusalem. It's one of the oldest cities in the history of civilization, right? And it happens to be important for three major Abrahamic faiths, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Everybody knows that. I also was interested to know that the Arabic translation for Jerusalem is Al-Quds, which means holy or holy sanctuary. Now, as a person from the Muslim heritage, we grew up with these stories that it's very important for us because it was the first Qibla in the revelations. And as a researcher, mere liye zyada important hai because, I want to know why it was changed then. So that's something different. Now, let's start with a question of what is the historical importance of Jerusalem in all the three faiths, which you will then continue with to explain the theological clash between Judaism and Islam. So both these questions are connected. Go ahead. Over to you, Umar.
Okay, so first of all, thank you for having me again. It has been a great experience. And above all, thank you for the generous introduction above all. So thank you for that. Now, of course, the Israel-Palestine issue has come to the forefront once again as the clashes have erupted recently and they are going on as we speak. It has not completely de-escalated into a ceasefire. So, of course, the problem exists. Now, you have brought in the historical context of it in the question. And the natural curiosity, the natural intrigue is that why are one of the largest communities on the planet, they are fighting over a small piece of land? So what is so special about that piece of land? So one has to go into its historical contextualize it in that way. So I think the first of all, let's break it down into a chronology of how and why it is important for three major world religions, starting with Judaism. Of course, the relationship between Jews and the Judaism thought and Israel land and the Palestinian land predates even recorded history. It goes thousands of years when Jews were living there as a community. Then, of course, then come the Christian part, who believe that Jerusalem is a place where Jesus Christ was brought and he preached there all his life and he was crucified there as well. So that site of Jerusalem is also very, very important for Christians as well. For almost 2000 years.
Interrupt here? I think we need to speak facts as they are. Jesus died a Jew, right? So there was no Christianity as such upon his death. So it's basically a very important site for the Jews because of the temple being built there, which got destroyed again and again. The temple wall is still there. That's why it's a very holy place for the Jews, right?
Holy place for all, of course. Yes. So Christians today, of course, they also hold Jerusalem in some respect, or there is some sanctity in the Christian world as well, though they don't relate to it in a way Jews do, of course. And then comes after that, historically, the youngest of the three Abrahamic religions, Islam, comes. And then according to Islamic tradition, the Prophet, while going on Miraj journey, he stayed there and he offered namaz. And he met other prophets at that place. So where later Al-Aqsa Mosque was established. So
I'll keep interrupting you because this is my area of research. The story that I grew up with, of course, is always the Miraj. But my positive story that I grew up with was that when the Caliph Umar, known as a very temperamental person and very angry and, zara swad se hi baat karte the, when he conquered Jerusalem, he said to have told them that he's not going to pray in the church there because if I do that, then the, followers are going to demolish it and create a mosque. So instead, somebody, as जैसे तब tradition था, he put down his cloak and just faced Mecca. This is where my research area comes. Did he face Mecca at that time, or did he face Jerusalem at that time? But anyway, he faced Mecca and he prayed, and that's where Al-Aqsa's foundations were laid. So this is a positive story
Right.
that I've grown up with, and this is very few people know about this. It also comes under the category where
Mhm.
we say the revisionism of Islamic history or the whitewashing of Islamic conquests and everything. But I've grown up with this story, so I tend to believe it because it's been, an attitude that most of the Islamic rulers have had. Tolerance
Haven't
for the
had
faith,
exactly, and it's very
right?
interesting you brought in that Qibla thing. That reminds me that of course it is sacred for Muslims because it was also the first Qibla, the
Right,
direction
right.
towards which Muslims also used to pray for at least 10, 11 years while the Prophet was preaching. And then one day, mid namaz, it was changed towards Mecca. So Muslims have had this sanctity towards Jerusalem. So that belief is still there. Even the Muslim community of today, it is called the third most sacred site in the Islamic theology. So we have seen that first the Jews, and then somewhat Christians in some capacity, in some way, and then Muslims. So they, all three major world religions relate to that small piece of land in one way or the other, whether it is the Temple Mount or the it was built by Solomon, or the Al-Aqsa Mosque. So there is some sanctity. So I think that is why it has grown into a clash today, because it has some history to it, and that is why that piece of land is important. Which brings me to the second part of your question, the theological clash between Islam and Judaism. So basically, the Islamic tradition differs from the Jewish tradition in a way that Muslims believe that Mecca is the place where Abraham was there, and he built the Kaaba and with his sons, and that's how the story grows. While of course the Jewish tradition is different. They do not believe that Abraham built the Kaaba. They believe that he was central to the whole land of the sacred land of Jerusalem and present day Israel and Palestine. So this whole difference in the story is very interesting, because when you say that Abraham was the one who built the Kaaba, then that begs the question that what happened that the Jews left the pagan site of Makkah and then shifted to Jerusalem? What happened? So that begs a very interesting question, and which of course it is lost to history. But the question is that where this clash comes in. The clash is basically of the ownership of the land of Jerusalem, that whether it is more sacred to the Jews or it is more sacred to the Muslims. So that is where the theological clash comes in.
uh, can't it be like this, that the continuity of history be recognized by all the three faiths? Because as far as my research says, is that Abraham is basically Jews, right? He believed
Mm.
in the commandments of Moses. The Quran speaks of all the prophets which came before the Prophet Muhammad. Jesus has a very, very holy reverence in Islam, and all
Mhm.
the other prophets are recognized, like people of the book are recognized, the Torah, the Injil, and the Quran. Why hasn't there been equal reverence? Why has it been that the city only belongs to us, whether it is from the Judaic side, the Christian side, or the Islamic side? Because if there's a continuity of narratives, it happens. Like take the ancient city of Troy, for example. Until we found it, we didn't know that there were cities and cities and cities beneath it, but the only narrative that we had was the battle of Troy. So why can't it be like that? Why has there been this break in the narrative?
This is unfortunate that, of course, there are people in every community who have this authoritarian or some colonial or imperialist mindset that they can't coexist. So same happens in Israel-Palestine also. While there have been efforts, the two-state solution, which we can come to later, what the two-state solution is, or the peace treaty between Yasser Arafat and the Israeli Prime Minister in 1994. So there have been some efforts halfway, or some bore fruit, some did not bear fruit, but most of the times when it comes to, of course, religion, it has a way of making people behave in a way maybe that they don't wish to, or they don't subscribe to completely. Or so in that sense, maybe uh, that is the reason that the two communities have refused to coexist till date, and the clashes are claiming lives and property, and it has garnered criticism from all over the world. So this is not a very healthy way to resolve a conflict, what is happening today, which should have been, but there are many factors to it. It is not just the Jews versus Muslims. Many factors come into play. We can look at the history, the British come into play, the colonial history comes into play. So there are a lot of factors due to which the two communities are failing to live without friction.
I understand why, because the Nakba, the displacement is so central to it. And because of the colonial powers, they one day just decided to displace people. And it's a historical wound that people never forget. Being from Kashmir, I understand this, ethnic cleansing and completely displacing people. Which brings to me to another question. The conflict right now has brought us images of the Palestinian resistance versus the Israeli defense forces to our living rooms. We are seeing it. I don't like to call it the Palestinian resistance, because I differ with you on this, is because uh, the only similarity that the conflict bears to Kashmir is the PLA, the Palestinian Authority, behaves exactly like the Hurriyat did, the so-called representatives of the people. What they did was they accumulated wealth, they hijacked the whole, representation. They settled their children and extended families abroad, and they built palatial mansions for themselves, and basically sent the common people as fodder to the front lines. So for me, the PA, the Palestinian Authority, even today behaves like that. They have categorically refused two-state solutions whenever it has cropped up, and being in touch with Palestinians in Gaza, what I came to conclude from their views was they were the actual enemies of the Palestinian people. Now, I'm not defending the Israeli Defense Forces. Of course, there have been war crimes and human rights violations from their side as well. But it's in the same situation as the Indian army is in Kashmir. The other side is not playing fair. It's using children as, human shields. It's using families as human shields. And it's a war that the state will always lose, because the other side is not playing fair. But go ahead. I want to hear your view. You said it's Palestinian resistance versus the IDF. I want to hear your view.
Yeah, so basically, when it comes to the Palestinians, uh, there are different terminologies by which they identify their struggle with. There are different ways in which they put it. So there are different fractions. The Palestinian side, before the 1948 war, or even after that, the Palestinian Authority versus the militant groups has happened in the past. The Fatah Party and Hamas have fought with each other as well. But unfortunately, the radical terrorist group, Hamas, has actually sort of won, especially in the Gaza Strip. They have, uh, and that is why the conflict is not going to resolve anytime soon. It doesn't look like it. Because, like you said, the other side, or if someone is not willing to differentiate between civilian lives and the military power, then that problem seldom has a solution, because the concept of human rights and terrorism and the definitions around them have been changed in a way to suit your narrative. So that is why the problem erupts. But now, looking at the current clash, the Sheikh Al Jarrah, where the as per the reports, the settlements were being increased and people were uh, sent away from their homes. So that thing has been happening for a long time. But at the same time, the increasing terrorism in the region by the Hamas, the firing of rockets and everything, that has escalated the conflict much more. So the recent clash has not only been increased because of that, but also there is an angle of Iranian influence in the region.
Mhm.
This cannot be ignored, because ever since the tension was increasing between United States and Iran,
Mhm.
and Qasem Soleimani was assassinated, and he was a very powerful person in the Middle East who was controlling many groups by Iran. So now we are seeing that Iran is coming out at the forefront in this recent clash, and they are supplying Hamas with all sorts of ammunition, with all sorts of weapons and everything, to keep firing the rockets on the civilians in Israel. And of course, Israel is bombing Gaza. They are uh, trying to kill the Hamas operatives, but also killing civilians in this bloody bloodbath that is happening. So I think that is where the whole clash comes in. That both sides are refusing to see that there can be some solution in a way that lives are not lost, at least civilian lives. So that is very important.
Uh, I'm not disagreeing here, but what I'm saying is maybe you have not heard the other side. In a sense, when you talk to the Palestinians, I'm talking about common Palestinians. In any narrative, there's always an elite narrative and a common narrative. I'm talking about common Palestinians. They say we need liberation. We need liberation from this victimhood. We need liberation from these years and years of conflict. We want to get on. We want to live peacefully with the Israelis. We want a two-state solution. Any solution which has been presented previously has been, because according to
Rejected.
Hamas, they feel until they totally destruct Israel, they are not going to give up. And that is something not pragmatic, not realistic, and doesn't bode well for anybody. So if you talk to
Mhm.
common Palestinians, they do want to be liberated from all of this. And they say, like, according to them, their history, every time the Palestinians have been taken in as refugees, they end up, going against the very place. Like Jordan, for example, right? There's a huge
Mhm.
refugee settlement in Jordan. But what did they do in the 70s? They turned up against the king themselves. Syria, for example,
Mhm.
they give these examples that the people, eventually why the Palestinian sympathy has come down over the years, especially after the 90s, is because the Israeli narrative started coming up. They started to present their own point of view, which is true. When you say that they are bombing the Hamas strongholds, you have to understand Hamas is storing ammunition and munitions in schools, in mosques, in neighborhoods. And Israeli
Right.
intelligence does their best to find out the places. And they have this wonderful technique which I learned was the roof knocking technique. They actually throw down leaflets from the drones. They actually announce that they're going to bomb, and they give them time to flee. Right? This is the same thing which happened with the Al
Mhm.
Jazeera building also, which was
Building
housing the Al
also, yeah.
Jazeera. So this is a state fighting for its existence. We should not forget the 6 Day War, right? Or the right. This is a state
Mhm.
which believes in coexisting. It's being called a democracy. I don't see it like that because it was built on religious lines, right? But then it still has a much more progressive constitution, and it does have Arabs living there. There's no discrimination. It's been called an apartheid state, but people don't completely understand the meaning of apartheid. So doesn't
Mhm.
it deserve to be a state? And doesn't
Mhm.
and Jerusalem deserves a much better fate. I mean, Jerusalem deserves the reverence of all the three faiths. Why does it have to be conflict? But here in the current conflict, understand the settlements also. Same point. The settlements are being used as a war rooms and storage for munitions. And the
Mhm.
Israelis, they tend to take up this tactic. As you said, it won't be a solution if the other side is not playing fair, and if the other side feels key, they need to destruct the Israelis completely, which is not a solution
Exactly.
at all.
So I would also add, in the same vein, I would add that when we look at it from the Israeli perspective, so I believe that Jews are the most persecuted community in world history.
Yes.
There can be no debate about that. From 2000, 3000 years ago till Hitler and persecution in Algeria and all Muslim majority countries as well. So the fight for Israel from Israel side is the fight for the only one Jewish state, and they're fighting for their survival. The Palestinians are fighting for 22nd Arab nation, and I'm not saying that the whole the protest of the Palestinians is invalid, but I'm just putting out the numbers that they are fighting for the 22nd Arab nation, and even Jordan has many Palestinian population, so it can be called a second Palestinian state in a way. So the numbers are very different from Israelis and for Palestinians. But of course, when we go back to 1948 and the way partition was done,
Yes.
but it was rejected. It was rejected because the two-state solution happened after that. The war happened, the lives were lost, and of course, many of the territory was occupied by Israel after that. But that two-state solution could have been, but Palestinian side rejected it, so they lost their chance. And now, when you are saying that let's do it according to the 1948 way, according to the two-state in United Nations, of course, Israel is not going to agree, because why did you do so much bloodbaths in the first place? So what was the need? So of course, that is not a practical thing. And of course, whether it's Hamas or Palestinian Authority, they need to understand that Israel is not going to disappear in air, nor is it going to go down the water. It is not going to evaporate. So if someone from that is the problem with Hamas, they do not need a solution with Israel. They want to eradicate the Jews. They eradicate the whole settlement from that area, and that is never going to happen, frankly. I mean, from a pragmatic point of view, that is just simply not feasible, especially the kind of support Israel has and the kind of technological advancements they have made. It is almost impossible. And that is, apart from the practical thing, it is a very heinous and malicious agenda, which is anti-Semitic, which is, and when we look at I noticed something interesting, that Jews have been persecuted so much that it has had an impact on the English language. For example, the word exodus was for the displaced Jews, and now it is used everywhere. The word diaspora was also used for Jews. Holocaust. So, everything, so they have been persecuted more than any other community. And interestingly, just to add a bit of trivia, Indian Hindus and Indian society has been one where they have not been persecuted. So they acknowledge that as well. So, but apart from that, in the Middle East, in the Christian world, there has been wide scale Jewish anti-Semitic crimes against Jews, and that is why the Israeli state gets its legitimacy from there.
You mentioned the Indian Hindus. Well, according to the Indian Hindus, you would be wrong, because they consider the Kashmiri Pandits as Indian Hindus. So they've had their exodus. They also call it the exodus. I call it an ethnic cleansing. They call it a genocide, which refers, it differs from definition to definition. We have not had any concentration camps, but yes, there was a pogrom. I call it a pogrom because I've been a witness to it, and I agree. So they are the only community among the Hindus who were persecuted, but not at the scale of the Shoah. The Holocaust is called the Shoah by the Jews, and 6 million Jews systematically all over Europe, in concentration camps. You had various documentation of it. Books are still coming up. Elie Wiesel has been Simon Wiesenthal. They're still hunting down Nazi criminals. I mean, it's become so much that even Germany has this guilt over what they've done, though they teach the Holocaust in their schools. But today, if you talk about, that the Muslims are taking over, the Germans are not going to listen to you, because they feel like, they'll be termed as anti-Semitic or racist and all. Europe guilt feeling. We were having a discussion earlier in the day, and they were asking, why does Europe have this thing, this anti-Hindu thing or anti-India thing? I said, because whenever they hear the word occupation, whether it's on Kashmir or Palestine, unke dimag mein wo aata hai guilt feeling ki hame ye nahi karna hai. We don't have to be like Hitler's Germany. So this is an automatic response, this automatic response ki if Palestine is occupied, we shouldn't be there, and if India is doing the same thing, they shouldn't be doing that. So this guilt feeling, I say the Palestinians need to put the blame rightly where it stands, with the British mandate. because we've had the same history. You know, the British cut us up, and they cut us up
Yes.
very badly. No, knowledge of geography. They just brought in this person who had never set foot in India, and the Punjab was basically what was divided, and absolutely cut us up and gave us a historical wound, जिसके repercussions हम आज तक भुगत रहे हैं, right? Especially you and me being Indian
Right.
Muslims, right? So the Palestinians
Hmm.
have had the same thing. If they really want to put the blame there, it's the British mandate. But it's easy for you
Hmm.
and me to talk here. You know, they've faced the Nakba and they still have the grandparents living of that generation who remember how cruelly the Nakba happened. Israelis are
Hmm.
very rational and objective. I mean, they found the Netanyahu government corrupt and they do speak in favor of the Palestinians. I found the Haaretz
Hmm.
newspaper as a very objective paper. I have a friend who's writing for that,
Yeah.
incidentally a Pakistani friend. And I believe rational, logical Israelis want peace. They want to live with the Palestinians. But they've offered this solution time and time again. But as you said correctly, Hamas has hijacked it all the time. I have heard the Fatah was a very secular organization. Is it possible to bring back the Fatah?
Right now, it is, in my reading, almost impossible the way sentiments have erupted over the years. But there was a time back in 2005 and 6, Fatah was very strong, and and when the election happened, though Hamas won, but Hamas won by a very little margin.
Hmm.
Fatah was still very strong, which led to that Gaza war in 2007
Hmm.
between the Fatah supporters and Hamas supporters.
Hmm.
Now we are talking at least 13 to 14 years after that. Now Hamas, the control Hamas has not only on the people, but on the minds and on the narrative,
Hmm.
that now no peace is possible between the two states. And we want to just wipe Jews off the map. When you have these demands and when they're echoed by countries like Iran, and which brings me to the current clash, how the leaders have reacted to it. For example, we are seeing something very interesting happening here, that whenever there is a clash happening, of course, it becomes a battleground for the world powers, the superpowers, the major blocks. Gee, right, whether it is North Korea, South Korea, or when it happened in North Vietnam, South Vietnam, the North was supported by Soviet Russia and South by United States. So there in current crisis also, the majority of the Western world, including United States and EU, they have come for the support of Israel and its right to defend itself. While the other side, on the other side, we have Turkey's Erdogan, we have, of course, Pakistan, Imran Khan, and these people have come out in support of Palestine. Interestingly, Russia has also warned Israel to be wary of the civilian deaths. He has also warned. The role of UAE and the Arab nations has become very interesting in recent times. The way they have made peace under Abraham Accord and with Trump as the mediator, that has been a very interesting development in Middle East, because Arabs were considered the most radical and draconian in that sense. But UAE and even Saudi Arabia, for example, have shown that some amity is possible between the two countries, and UAE even opened its embassy, and the other way around also that happened. So Arab world is moving in that direction where they have put pragmatism over emotion, and they have understood that okay, this state exists, it's not going anywhere, let's try to coexist also. So they have some achievable goals, which is not to say that Israel's civilian problems and the bombing of civilians has to be whitewashed, but like the Arab world, it needs to be said confidently. At the same time, when you are saying that Israel has no right to kill civilians, you also have to say that Israel has a right to defend itself, because there are civilians on both sides. You can't just say, because when you are saying that Israel has no right to kill civilians, but you don't add that Israel has a right to defend itself, you are basically a Hamas supporter,
Hmm.
because that is what the stand of Hamas is.
Right.
So that stand needs to be said in the same breath. Otherwise, it becomes very problematic.
Uh, uh, you brought in this relationship that the Arab nations are changing with Israel, which was, it was not a surprise. We knew there were backdoor channels happening and everything. But when I talk to geopolitical experts, they all say that the Arab world has realized that they need to coexist now because the future, not the current future like 20, 30 years, but eventually future, 50 or 100 years from now, people will have to live. It has to be a real global village in the real sense. So this enmity towards a Jewish state is not going to work anymore. Hence the overtures. Hence, Saudi and the UAE coming up, and even Qatar is loosening a little bit up to now. Which presents a problem for these states when they see Palestinian deaths being portrayed on Al Jazeera and everything, because eventually, they'll be questioned by their populations that why would they be supporting a state which is killing Palestinian civilians. So I think the intervention from the states has been correct. They do need to admonish Israel, but at the same time, they do not need to be politically correct as far as I see. What you said rightly, Israel has a right to defend itself, and they need to admonish Hamas itself also. This is again connected to India as well. India's reaction has been very balanced, and I feel I support that because it's always been non-aligned. And I remember Fidel Castro coming to Delhi when Indira Gandhi was there, and I understood the non-aligned movement as a school project. But eventually, Prime Minister Modi recognized Israel. He visited. He was the first PM to visit Israel. So same thing. When the world over, everybody is recognizing that they need to keep their diplomatic relations with Israel. They need to recognize the state of Palestine. Then why can't the representatives of the Palestinian people understand this? They feel that this Arab world has betrayed them, by having diplomatic relations with Israel. But this has to change. Now you're saying
Mm-hmm.
Iran is acting as a mischief maker. Is that what you're saying?
Mm-hmm. Basically, India's response has not changed very much in its history of independent India. When prime ministers used to go to meet Israeli prime ministers, they also used to meet the Palestinian Authority leader in the same visit, which
I,
changed with
I don't
PM
think
Modi.
any PM did before Mr. Modi. I remember they would only visit the Palestinian side. They would never go to Tel Aviv. Never. This is the first
Yeah,
time.
but it changed. It changed with PM Modi, who visited Tel Aviv, right, in 2017, I think. So basically, there has been amity between, and the Indo-Israeli friendship is actually based on a lot of things. Basically, there has been a cooperation, especially in the times of pandemic as well. The Israel sent doctors and equipment and medical supplies to help India, and there were widespread prayers for the health and the prosperity of the Indian people.
The
So
IDF is
that
also
friendship
the IDF is also helping us strengthen the LOC. You have to understand we've imported a
has,
lot of equipment from there, so it's been a lot of
right.
inflation has come down because of the IDF. Most of the gadgets, and
Yes,
they're technologically very very advanced. So we've been using some of the
yes.
technology to fortress
So
the
the relations
LOC.
have been amiable. Relations have been amiable, and there have been no much resistance or friction. The recent bombings on near Israel embassy happened in New Delhi, but it still did not deter the relations between the two countries. And Israel claimed that it was done by Iran in New Delhi. So Israel also blamed it on Iran. The real story did not come out who did it, but there has been no altercations between the two countries, which I think there is no need to as well. There is a problem on which, like you said, Israel needs to be admonished. But yes, as a state, one needs to have diplomatic relations. We have diplomatic relations with the Arab world as well.
Hmm.
We have the diplomatic relations with the United States with all its problems, the Arab world with all its problems of radicalization and funny ideas. We have diplomatic relations with them as well. So I think in the globalized world, when we are becoming a global village, and India has been traditionally that country, like you mentioned, the NAM, and so having a balanced narrative
I
on
mean, so
every
far,
situation.
India's foreign policy has been absolutely correct. I mean, I don't see any flaws in it.
Mhm.
You have to give credit to the BJP government. I mean, whoever thought of it, eventually governments
Mhm.
change, parties change. But the foreign policy so far has been correct. They just added Israel to their foreign policies. And they are not,
Right.
because earlier it used to be a left liberal, kind of uh, speak as such. But now they realize
Mhm.
it's no shame in saying that they support Israel while at the same time standing up for the human rights of the Palestinian people. So India's foreign
Right. Right.
policy is so far quite correct, quite correct. Now,
Right.
where do you see this whole conflict? Because it affects the Muslim world a lot. It does, right? I come from Kashmir, you come from Aligarh, you know the discourse which is there in our living rooms, on the streets, in our academic bastions and everything. And it's always,
Mhm.
Yehudi versus the Muslim, वो हमेशा होता है. हम कितना भी articulation
Mhm.
Facebook पे करें या social media पे करें, or the way that you and me are talking very civilly, it doesn't happen
Mhm.
like that, on the ground.
Mhm.
So where do you see the conflict? Because it affects Indian Muslims a lot, बहुत ज़्यादा.
It affects Indian Muslims in a very weird way because ideally it is a human rights conflict. It is there, but ideally, when it comes to Israel, Israel has when it comes to Indian state and Israel, the relation has been much better. So when it comes, while the Palestinian and Indian Muslim having a Muslim Ummah sentiment with Palestine does not hold too much uh, ground because of there have been many instances where the brotherhood concept has been proven to be false. We have Pakistan, Bangladesh, and different things that have happened. So we have disproven that. So when it comes to Indian Muslims, there is a level of anti-Semitism which is problematic and needs to be checked because for that there is not enough interaction and communication because Jews being such a small minority, it is highly unlikely that any average anti-Semitic Muslim has even talked to a Jew before in his life. So it is highly unlikely. But there are funny notions that are being put by the sometimes the radical leaders, the Islamist uh, head of organizations who want to wield power. So for that, so that anti-Semitism is propagated uh, to disturbing levels. So that problem exists. Now coming to how this where this conflict is going, I'm of course I can't predict where it is going. Nobody can predict where it is going, but in my whatever understanding I have of the situation, I think that, like I said, even the Muslim world is understanding, beginning to realize that of course Israel is not going anywhere, it is going to stay. And the demands by the Palestinian sides have to become more practical. And that will happen when the Muslim world gives some sort of uh, like the Arab world is changing the narrative in
Has
some way
done
or
a
the other.
re-evaluation. The Arab world has done a re-evaluation, right?
Re-evaluation. So maybe in future, which looks highly unlikely today, but in future, if that sort of re-evaluation happens on the Palestinian side, on the bastion of Gaza Strip, that might be the time when the two are again able to come on the table, sit and talk about what can be done. I don't think they're going back to the two-state solution of 1948 or 67. I don't think that is happening. But I think some other way under which the land is divided in a much more safe and sane way, where the conflict does not increase, whether it is in the West Bank or Gaza Strip, I don't know. But some reevaluation has to happen for the two sides to come together and build a state where this clash doesn't continue. So that is
Well,
what I think.
I hope for the sake of Indian Muslims that this conflict is solved because it's extremely frustrating, and I hope it's solved. I hope it's solved the way that you say. Of course, a major re-evaluation be done by the Palestinians, by the Arab world doing it, and by the Indian Muslims as well. Thank you so much,
Mm.
Umar. It's been very enlightening, and I hope to see you again for much more enlightening talks. Thank you.
It's always a good experience, always an enriching experience. Would love to be back on for another discussion.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.